Why is it that some of the people who hurt us the most become the hardest to let go of? You know the relationship is unhealthy. You know it's draining your peace. You cry more than you smile. Your anxiety increases. Your relationship with God weakens. And yet somehow, you still feel emotionally pulled back toward them. Even after the lies, the manipulation, the heartbreak. Why? Because toxic relationships often feel addictive, and many people mistake that emotional addiction for love. But what if the intensity you feel is not actually healthy connection? What if it's emotional bondage disguised as passion? Today, we are going deep into why toxic relationships become so difficult to escape, what Scripture says about destructive attachments, and why some people keep returning to relationships that are slowly destroying them spiritually. And by the end of this video, you may finally understand why letting go has felt almost impossible. 1. Chaos can become emotionally addictive. Most people think addiction only happens with substances, but emotional chaos can become addictive too. Toxic relationships often create intense emotional highs and devastating lows. One moment you feel wanted, chosen, loved intensely. The next moment, you feel rejected, ignored, emotionally abandoned, and your brain becomes trapped chasing the high of temporary affection again. That cycle creates emotional dependency. Proverbs 14:12 says, "There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death." Some relationships feel powerful emotionally, while quietly destroying your peace spiritually. And the frightening part is this: many people confuse emotional intensity with genuine love, but healthy love produces stability, not constant emotional whiplash. Because peace and obsession are not the same thing. 2. Toxic people often use intermittent affection. This next part explains why toxic relationships are so psychologically powerful. Toxic people often give affection inconsistently. One day they are loving, attentive, emotionally intense. The next day they become cold, distant, emotionally unavailable. And without realizing it, you become addicted to trying to earn the good version of them again. This creates emotional confusion that traps many people for years. 1 Corinthians 14:33 says, "For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace." Notice that carefully. Confusion is not the fruit of healthy love. Healthy relationships become clearer over time. Toxic relationships become more emotionally unstable over time. And eventually, your entire emotional world revolves around trying to keep the relationship from collapsing again. That is emotional bondage, not love. 3. Toxic relationships often target wounded people. This part is deeply important. Many toxic relationships attach themselves to unhealed wounds: loneliness, rejection, fear of abandonment, low self-worth. And toxic people often sense those wounds immediately, not always consciously, but instinctively. So they become exactly what you emotionally crave at first: attention, validation, intense affection. And suddenly, you feel emotionally chosen in ways you've never experienced before. But over time, a relationship slowly becomes controlling instead of comforting. And because the attachment formed through emotional wounds, walking away feels terrifying. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." Guard your heart, because wounded hearts often mistake attention for love. And not everyone who makes you feel desired is safe for your soul. 4. Samson is the perfect example. Samson's story is one of the clearest biblical examples of toxic attachment. Judges chapter 16 describes a man chosen by God, yet emotionally entangled with someone destroying him slowly. Delilah manipulated him repeatedly. The warning signs were obvious, but Samson stayed emotionally attached anyway. Why? Because toxic attachment blinds discernment. Eventually, Samson lost his strength, his freedom, and his clarity. Not overnight, gradually. That is exactly how many toxic relationships operate today, slowly weakening someone spiritually while convincing them the relationship is passionate. But real love should not constantly destroy your peace. 5. Toxic relationships can pull you away from God. One of the biggest warning signs of a toxic relationship is spiritual distance from God. Your prayer life weakens, your convictions blur, your discernment fades, and eventually, your emotional attachment becomes louder than God's voice in your life. 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, "Do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character." Relationships influence people deeply, and some connections slowly normalize compromise. You begin excusing behavior you once knew was unhealthy, ignoring red flags you once would have recognized immediately. Why? Because emotional addiction distorts wisdom. That's why discernment matters before attachment becomes deep. Because once emotional dependency forms, walking away can feel almost impossible. 6. Why people keep going back. This is the heartbreaking cycle many people live in. The relationship hurts them. They leave emotionally devastated. Then suddenly the toxic person changes temporarily. Apologies, affection, promises, and hope returns again. But usually, the cycle repeats. Ecclesiastes 7:26 says, "I find more bitter than death the woman who is a snare." Now this principle applies beyond gender. Some relationships become traps emotionally. You know you're suffering, but attachment keeps pulling you back, and eventually you stop trusting your own judgment. That's why many people stay trapped far longer than they should, because addiction always whispers the same lie. Maybe this time it will finally change. 7. Healing requires detachment. Now here's the hopeful part. Healing is possible, but healing usually requires distance from what keeps poisoning your peace. You cannot heal properly while constantly reopening emotional wounds. Romans 12:2 says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Healing starts with renewing the mind, seeing clearly again, recognizing that chaos is not love, control is not love, manipulation is not love, and emotional obsession is not proof someone is meant for you. Sometimes it's proof you need healing. And honestly, many people do not miss the person. They miss the emotional intensity the relationship created. That realization changes everything. So if you've been wondering why certain toxic relationships feel impossible to escape emotionally, now you understand. Toxic attachment often creates emotional addiction disguised as love. But God never designed relationships to destroy your peace. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." A sound mind. Not constant confusion, not emotional chaos, not spiritual exhaustion. Healthy love brings clarity, peace, safety, and growth. So ask yourself honestly today, am I holding on to someone because they are healthy for me, or because I became addicted to the emotional chaos they created? And if this message spoke directly to your situation, drop a comment saying, "God, help me choose peace over toxic attachment." Because sometimes the hardest relationships to leave are the ones your soul needs freedom from the most.